Okay, we'd like to welcome everybody to this very, very important program and thank Reverend Nicole Martin for very graciously accepting our invitation to speak to us today. I had the privilege of meeting Reverend Martin, I think, the past 2 or 3 years at a Jewish evangelical conference, which is convened annually. Rabbi Saul Berman, who's on the call, was also part of that, and a number of other of our members and other people beyond. Reverend Martin is the Executive Director of Trauma Healing at the American Bible Society. She is also the Assistant Professor of Ministry and Leadership Development at the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. She's the author of 2 books, Made to Lead, Empowering Women in Ministry, and Leaning in, Letting Go, a Lenten devotional. Dr. Martin serves as one of the co-conveners for the Jewish Evangelical Conversations. She and her husband, Dr. Mark Martin, live just outside of Baltimore with their 2 daughters, Addison and Josephine. I heard Dr. Martin speak on this topic, it was just about 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, and was really very, very moved by those particular comments. And I've learned to respect her. When you go to a conference with a lot of people, you don't always pay attention to everybody who speaks because, well, everybody has that experience. But when Nicole Martin speaks, like E.F. Hutton, everybody listens, because she has something very, very worthwhile to say. And so it's a real pleasure to thank her again and to introduce her to the members of the RCA who are on the call and to those who will be listening to the recording when we're able to distribute it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a privilege to be with each of you, and it's a blessing to see you even virtually. These are some interesting and trying times, and so I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you today. I have a few slides that I'll just kind of walk through very briefly, and then I want to leave some time for dialogue and conversation at the end. And the goal here is basically for us to share in the areas where I see from my own vantage point are opportunities for greater collegiality and support, and also hopefully provide some another vantage point that might strengthen all of us in faith. This first slide is one that I'm pretty excited about. This is my ancestry. These are my relatives. The people in the center are my great-great-great-grandparents. And you can probably tell from their
clothing. You're doing double duty this week.
They were enslaved. My great-great-grandparents on both sides, my mother and my father's side, were slaves in the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. We have some tracing of lineage through Sudan, and some suspected lineage in Liberia, but because of the challenges of lost records through the Middle Passage and through slavery, it's often hard for us to figure out exactly what country our relatives came to America from. But this is the oldest picture that we have of relatives in our family. And when I see this picture, I see a man and a woman who survived more than I could imagine, who thrived more than I could imagine, but they did it not for themselves, but for me, so that I could do the things that they could never do, like go to school or have a paycheck or own a business or something along those lines. On the left side, the older gentleman at the top left, that is my mom's grandfather, Samuel Cartledge. He migrated from the South after being a sharecropper in the Carolinas, migrated to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, worked the steel mill, and actually lived in a place in Pittsburgh called West Mifflin, Pennsylvania. My mom's stories, when she thinks about her growing up years, actually included the only dentist in Pittsburgh that would see Black people, which happened to be a Jewish dentist. So I look at that picture and I see my great-grandfather and recognized again how much our family has overcome and how proud I believe he would be of where we are today, and yet at the same time how grieved he would be at how very little has changed. The picture right below him is my great-grandfather Butler. He was a preacher, a Baptist preacher. The picture at the far right at the top, that is my grandfather's mother and father. And then the picture right below them is the mother of the woman sitting on the side of the chair. So my ancestry means a lot because in these times, it's important for me to remember that as a descendant of slaves, I still have a story to tell, that my narrative, my perspective is different and necessary for times like these. And when I think through the challenges of what we go through now, much like I think it's probably true for anyone who's come through some generational oppression, you have the privilege in some ways of looking back through tragedy and saying, if we were able to survive in some way from that, we can make it through this in some way. So that kind of sets the framework for some areas that I think are important as we consider the current state of African Americans in the US, and even as we consider what might be commonalities between African Americans and Jews, particularly living in America. So I think one area of significance that we have is the significance of land. Now, these two pictures are significant, not to overuse the word, because there is a sense in America that African Americans don't have a land. I was reading in an article the other day that described African American slaves as stolen people on a stolen land. And I remember when we were having conversations last week in the Jewish evangelical conversations, I remember hearing one of the rabbis say, it doesn't matter how bad things get here, we'll always have Israel, we'll always have this sense of home. And part of me rejoiced because I would long for that kind of understanding, and part of me grieved knowing that as an African American, I don't have that same sense. Post-slavery, there was a movement of a recognition, well, maybe we can move the slaves back to Africa. But the difference of culture was so strong then that there wasn't a sense of home, even in the sense of the motherland. So this significance of land has many, many tentacles in the US. In Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, there was a massive massacre of what was at that time called the Black Wall Street. And during the Great Migration, this is between 1910 and 1970s, when Black people tried to move out of the South to get a better life, to try and create better futures for their children. They tended to migrate up to the Northeast, to places like Pittsburgh, like Philadelphia, like New York, like Connecticut. Those who were in Texas started to migrate west, and those who were between Texas, Alabama, even Tennessee started to migrate to the Midwest. So there was this huge migration. There were great jobs being made by oil in the time in Oklahoma, but and that created such a community in Tulsa that it became a safe place for Black people to earn a living and build wealth. And Black Wall Street became the place for wealthy and middle-class Black Americans to learn how to build a new future, maybe even 50, 60 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was decided by a small group that then grew into a large mob of white residents that success was a threat to their vitality, was a threat to their livelihood. And on that day in 1921, as you can kind of see, I don't know if you can see the writing in the picture, this particular picture says, running the Negro out of Tulsa. And that was June. You can't quite make out the date, but it was June in 1921. So this is just part of the legacy, that even when Black Americans tried to have some sense of land, there were both overt and covert efforts to prevent that from happening. And this is just one story. Charlotte, North Carolina is another story. This is a picture of what was called Brooklyn. This was another vibrant middle-class Black community in the South, trying to build and make businesses and have banks and cleaners and the like. And it was decided by law that the only place they could build the highway, which is now 77 North. I don't know if you've ever been to Charlotte, but they decided to build 77 and 277 right through the middle class Black neighborhoods. So these kinds of things have been happening for African Americans for a very long time, so much so that there's a perception that African Americans are not patriotic, that they're not real citizens of America. And it's not that. It's the sense that even the pursuits of trying to have land have been so thwarted in the past that there's become a certain generational trauma associated with land. You don't feel at home where you are in the US. You don't quite know where you can go to be safe. So there is a sense of homelessness. And for African American Christians, this homelessness is transferred into energy for this eschatological hope. We long for hope and glory. We long for our heavenly home. It's what the spirituals were founded on. This place is not my home. Swing low, sweet chariot, come in for to tarry me home, to carry me home. So there is a certain placement of home not on this earth, but it still leaves this question of what does land look like for the Black community? This next area that I think is really important for our conversation today is a sense of community among the oppressed. I absolutely love this picture of Dr. King in the march. And I don't know if this picture has significance for you. For me, it's a reminder that some of the first statements I saw against poor treatment of Black people in the US were from the rabbinic associations that I know. They were from Jewish rabbis. They were from organizations that I've partnered with in the past. And there is a sense of community among the oppressed, that when you have been part of a group of people that have suffered, you're more sensitive to the suffering of groups of other people. So I think that this current reality has created a beautiful opportunity for solidarity, for common hope, and for strength among groups that often feel marginal and small, but can be great when they come together. And I also think that this community doesn't ignore difference. I think one of the unique moments of this time is that we don't have to be colorblind. We don't have to pretend that there's unity of agreement theologically, or that we have the same practices or carry the same goals. But there is a certain unifier in suffering, that when you can really be one with others in suffering, you have a way of being in community with someone in a way that you really couldn't before. There's a theologian, his name is Howard Thurman. He was one of the professors, the dean of chaplaincy at Andover Newton Theological Seminary during the time that Dr. King was in seminary. He really is kind of understated, but really was one of the greatest theologians of the civil rights movement. And Howard Thurman suggests that suffering is a discipline of the spirit. And those who understand what happens in suffering are those who have the joy, the privilege, the rich experience of journeying alongside those who suffer in ways that those who don't suffer cannot. So it could even be argued that for people who don't believe they've suffered, they actually can't connect with us in ways that we can, because we are from people who have suffered. And here's the very last thing. I think it's important to name that this is a time where sometimes the community of the oppressed feels like a safer space than the community of those who say they have the same theological views. I have had some really hard conversations these past couple of weeks, and they have not been just hard conversations with non-Christians or with people who don't see faith in the same way that I do. These hardest conversations for me have come from conversations with white Christians. And part of Christianity, part of the theology that's embedded within Christianity, assumes a certain unspoken cultural norm. And that unspoken cultural norm tends to be white. So for people of color who are Christian, who go through seminary, it is not uncommon that in the erasure of culture comes with it a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, it comes with an anti-Semitism, because it's a refusal to see the purposefulness of what it means to embrace and be part of a culture that was framed by Jewish culture. I mean, this has so many tentacles in it. This erasure of culture also has implications on how we treat others, various people who have gender differences. I mean, how we treat men and women. It's got all of these tentacles in it. But also embraced within that, there is a sense that for some white Christians, race and cultural context is not important to God. And therefore, they believe if it's not important to God, then it's not important to me. This article on the far left, 5 Ways Christians Are Getting Swept into a Secular Worldview in This Cultural Moment. This article kind of supports a general view that the Bible does not talk about culture and that God does not care about context. And it's this really negative theology that winds up ignoring whiteness as culture and seeing whiteness as norm. The second was actually yesterday. This was Louis Giglio. I don't know if you all have heard of this, but he basically said that, the curse of slavery in America is a curse, but that he's uncomfortable with the term white privilege. So why don't we throw away white privilege, call it white blessing, and don't think of slavery as a curse, but think of slavery as a blessing, because if we didn't have slavery, we wouldn't have the America that we have today. As you know, this has a variety of challenges. I mean, this is a very, very complex statement, but it's informed by a certain perspective of theology, one that I think in times like these needs to be reshaped and corrected. And then on the far right on my screen is J.D. Greer. He is the president of the Southern Baptist Association. And for years, the Southern Baptist Association has been really at the forefront of not taking ownership for the ways that we've created racist theologies that are against Jews and against people of color. So J.D. Greer made a very bold proclamation that not just that Black lives matter to God, that Black lives matter in our country, but he also made the proclamation that race and context matter to God. Now, most people of color and most Jewish theologians would say, of course, culture matters. And I think it's taking a long time for some, particularly white evangelicals, to come to this point. But again, I think it's because there's been a lot of theology wrapped around whiteness that hasn't always been named. So I know I've said a whole lot. I know I hope I haven't overloaded you with anything that's absolutely madness or craziness, but would love to talk with you and to dialogue with you further.
Thank you so much. I could have listened without interruption for the entire time. Really, really, thank you very much for being open with us. And this is a difficult conversation.
Yes.
And we are strangers. We're brothers and sisters, but we're strangers.
Yes.
And I thank you. I thank you for that. We're going to open up in a minute for questions. I think I muted everybody, so if they want to ask, the best way to do it will be to indicate on the chat that you'd like to be called upon, and then we'll call upon everybody one at a time. And this way, try to maintain some sense of decorum, which we generally don't have in our synagogues, and I imagine Black churches don't have too much decorum
That's
either.
right.
So another thing that we have in common.
Yeah.
I want to ask for some advice from you for the rabbis that are here, in terms of some very real, practical ways that we can be engaged with the Black community in constructive ways. Just one other caveat to that, and then ask you to respond, is that there is some concern with Black Lives Matter movement and other types of things where anti-Semitism is rearing its ugly head. Pro-BDS is prominent. And we find that people who are on our side that are very well-meaning and want to be engaged and helpful are very concerned and very put off by those types of things and aren't sure what to do and where and how to turn. So could you take a minute or two to address that?
Absolutely. So on the what we can do, I found that there has been such strength and solidarity during this time. I mean, on the lowest spectrum, there is a sense of saying, I'm with you, I hear you, I support you, I want to encourage you. For those who have friends or neighbors or colleagues of some sort that are Black Americans, I think that solidarity means something. And it especially means something coming from the Jewish community because, the picture that I showed of Dr. King is a very prominent part of our culture. I know many African Americans who share stories like my mom that say during the civil rights or, during the Jim Crow laws, it was a Jewish cleaner. It was a Jewish, shop owner that opened the doors and said, I don't see you as other. I see you as a human being. So that legacy has created an open door. I think that I've seen some really proactive stances. I've seen statements made on social media by Jewish groups, and I think that's been extremely helpful. I mean, I think that there is merit to being together for those who choose to protest. And we got to remember this is still COVID-19, so we can't be crazy about it. But I think that solidarity goes a really long way. And even just the conversation. In this space, I can share with you that sometimes the barrier in Christian spaces, the black and white barrier often happens because of lack of conversation. There's an unwillingness to hear. There's an unwillingness to talk and engage in real conversation. And so if there is one thing that we can do that feels simple and right, it is to engage in conversation. I mean, conversations like these, tell me about your experience. I found that to be a helpful tool when the synagogue attacks started to happen. I immediately started reaching out to my Jewish friends saying, first of all, how are you? Second of all, what can I do to support? And most of the time it was like, just, pray, or just tell your people, tell your communities how wrong this is. On the farthest level, the response was, help your pastors to recognize the damage that is done when we try to erase Jewish culture from scripture. That just doesn't help. So those conversations are critically important. On the Black Lives Matter movement, I absolutely agree. And I think this has been a challenge for people of across multiple different faiths. Black Lives Matter as a movement has some pretty controversial elements to it. And that's why when I talk about this, I'm very careful to say Black Lives Matter to God. Black Lives Matter in our nation. I heard Rick Warren's church say, we believe that until Black Lives Matters, we can't fully declare that all lives matter. So I think it's the way that we nuance what we mean. But I also think it is okay and right to say, when we say Black Lives Matter, we're talking about the individuals. We cannot at this stage affirm the formal movement. And you'll find there are a lot of Christians that cannot affirm the formal movement.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Rabbi Blau, Benjamin Blau, please unmute yourself.
First, I want to say thank you. Thank you for taking the time to engage in the dialogue and taking the time to share your experiences with us. It's very meaningful and very impactful. I guess the question I have is really a question sort of for both of us, but getting your perspective.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we talk about trying to change hearts and minds, which is of course key, and listening, just listening and feeling people's experiences. It is so powerful to recognize that things that I joke, I was explaining to a congregant that I take for granted. If I get caught, if I have a traffic ticket,
True.
I'm embarrassed because I'm embarrassed to tell my wife. Right. I'm embarrassed because my insurance is going to go up, but I'm not fearful.
Absolutely.
And my African-American friend is literally fearful. So it's first, it's important just to hear.
Yes.
The question is tackling the larger issues.
Yes.
Sometimes it feels like, how are we going to do that? It's nice to explain and listen, but how do we collectively deal with some of the larger issues and change that very pattern of behavior? How do we do that?
Yes. And that is the core question. That's the core question. And I would suggest that each of us has to answer that question with our own means. I would say that question has to be answered. It must be through voting. I was speaking with Rabbi Bubko earlier this week, and he said, you evangelicals, you have these big, big numbers. And so when you tell people to vote, it actually makes a difference. He said, we are a small people. And so, when you say go out and vote, it's not going to make a blip on the scale. I would argue with that. I would say that voting does matter, and speaking up in these cases, that matters. But the next step of activity, I do think we're going to have to make some major reforms. Now, my personal perspective is some of the reforms we're looking to make, like police reform, cannot come until we look at the history and until we embrace why police forces exist in America. Police forces exist in America because they needed patrollers to keep slaves in their places and to keep them from running away. Until we name that in many cases, police forces in the South were in existence to protect whites and to keep Blacks in their place, we can't go far. I think one of the things that I'm learning, and I'm wrestling with this question, I hope I'm not rambling, it's just I'm wrestling with this as we speak. I think part of this is an educational action step. How do we properly educate our communities on Black history, not just in February, not just when we happen to walk into a Black church, but how do we share a narrative that is inclusive? I would say the same even about Jewish culture. it wasn't until I had an opportunity to go to Israel that I realized how important it is for me to just know history, to understand the implications of this history and this narrative for my own life. So I would say that there are some educational opportunities that we have as well, and what it looks like to hold up pictures of Black people or people of color that have made significant strides in America to make us where we are today. But it's a complex question, and I think there's a whole lot to do. And I think for me, at the end of the day, the question is, what can I do right now? And I can write a letter to my congressman or my senator. I can vote. I can protest. I can tell the stories to my children, which, by the way, is one of the best Jewish traditions in the world. The ability to tell the story to the next generation is one of the greatest gifts that we have. And I think that's at least a step in the right direction. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there somebody else who would like to make a comment, pose a question? So I see Abby Lerner on my screen. She's smiling now. So we have a conversion program, and Abby is our human face for its potential converts to Judaism. By Schaffner, I'll call you in a moment. And she deals with a lot of people of color who are looking to convert to Judaism.
Yeah.
Mrs. Lerner, I'm putting you on the spot. You can say no to me, but would you like to perhaps make a comment that Reverend Martin can respond to? You have to unmute yourself.
Listen, it's a tremendous eye opener for me. Can be very emotional about this. I went to college in the 70s. I was a big pro-civil rights person as a teenager and in college. The sadness for me was watching the radicalization of the civil rights movement. And those of us who were so pro somehow turned into the enemy. I'm not quite sure how. It has never been my personal experience in my personal life with people of color from the African American community, and certainly not in my work with conversion candidates, where the only thing that seems to bond us is our love of God, our sense of spirituality. And for me, the work that I'm doing with the RCA, Rabbi Dratch, is a sort of coming home for me to where I was originally, of seeing people united and thinking along the same lines, talking about God and understanding that spirituality is something that adds to our life, whether it's Christian spirituality or Jewish spirituality or even, spirituality of Islam. So for me, the work that I do with our conversion candidates has been a coming home. I always was, and I would like to be.
That's beautiful.
Okay. And there's challenges, which maybe we'll talk about another time.
We spoke about that yesterday a lot, and it's heartbreaking for me. I don't know if you saw Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg of the Boca Raton Synagogue interviewed a young man, Marvell Joseph, who is a big AIPAC, a big Israel supporter, whose family is from Haiti, and that's why he became pro-Israel. Israelis were in Haiti and helped his family after the hurricane. But I was crying because he's also been pulled over by the police.
Absolutely.
He also has to be so careful. He said when he drives from Boca to Tallahassee, he must wear a suit and a tie, lest he be pulled over by the police.
Yep. Absolutely right.
For me, that was heartbreaking.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Rabbi Schaffner?
Yeah, thank you for doing this. It's really so important. One of the strengths of the Orthodox community is its deep sense of being so interconnected with each other. But I think the other side of that coin is we can often feel insular and not really get what's going on. It becomes hard for us to really, at least for me, to figure kind of out what's going on in the world. For me, what I found is that I have a desire to do something, and I want to do something that will help structurally, because obviously, you know, for 10 years, things have been happening in Ferguson and here and in Atlanta, and you know, so it feels like change is afoot. And obviously, I believe that all human beings are made in the image of God, and I want, you know, and kindness is so central for all of us. But I'm a rabbi in Washington, D.C., and so I guess I'm trying to figure out how to, and maybe it's a little bit like Rabbi Bauer's question, how do you make structural change, or how do you even do anything without it coming off in some way as partisan? You know, are there specific things and paths? I mean, I can reach out to a Black pastor in my neighborhood. That's easy, but I'm not sure how to go beyond that without, you know, somebody from who, you know, I have congregants who work in the Justice Department, and they're going to say, well, Black Lives Matter is all about, you know, dismantling the police. What are you, crazy? You know, or it's about, you know, we've thrown, you know, so much money into housing and all these things, and it hasn't helped, you know, and here's what it says in the Wall Street Journal. And so I don't know how to move forward without alienating people.
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about the things that grieve us, one of the things that grieves me is how the pursuit of equality can so easily be politicized. It grieves my heart. When tomorrow, Friday is Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865 was the day that the Emancipation Proclamation reached the last slaves in Texas, 2 years after it was written. And it's always been it's been a part of the American narrative. It's been a holiday for some, but not for all. It's just kind of been a benign space to recognize the strides of those post-slavery, of how far we've come, and to grieve and lament over how far we've got to go. But now Juneteenth is political. And if you engage in it's so, and those tables can turn so quickly that it makes you very hesitant to join anything, because you don't want to offend. You don't want to put off people, especially people within the congregation, especially people who may be donors, especially, and the list goes on. So in DC in particular, I think you've got a lot of latitude because you have the NAACP as a potential partner. And even if it was just looking at the list of action steps put out by the NAACP and selecting which ones are appropriate actions for you to take, that means something. We also have, there are a number of interfaith gatherings. I'm not far from DC, so I know of a few of them. And even to sit in those rooms and to parse out what action looks like, that would be helpful. But I also don't want to discount the significance of reaching out to the Black pastor that you know. I think sometimes in times like these, we can have this great pursuit for the grand, for the thing that's going to be the best, biggest, scalable, impactful thing we can do. And it can cause us to miss out on the smaller things that actually will make a greater transformation over the long haul. So I don't want you to discount that. I think that conversation is important. Asking that Black pastor, what are you doing? That's so important. And maybe even coming up with ideas. Hey, I'm thinking about doing this with our congregation, having a day of lament, being present in a particular meeting, pushing for a particular change that we feel is right for us and doesn't cross too many political lines. I think that's a big deal. Now, on the flip side of that, I would probably be lying to you if I would say that there's something you can do that wouldn't have cost. And I think this is the challenge of this season, that we're going to have to really calculate the risk. I've seen a lot of statements come out, and we're going to have to put some action behind those statements, and it will involve cost. Right now, pastors of Christian churches are thinking, if I come out on this, I'm going to lose. I could potentially lose my pulpit. And I think there is a way that we're going to have to say, all right, I feel like this is the right step I'm going to take. I've talked to the Black pastor. I've looked at the suggestions from groups like the NAACP. I've thought through this, and I really believe it's the best course of action, but it will probably come with some cost. And I think that's the hard work. What am I willing to risk in this conversation that might make a difference and allow me to operate in my own faith integrity?
Thank you. Rabbi Feldman.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nicole, for being available to us. This is really
Yeah.
powerful and really very, very makes a big difference.
Mhm.
Uh, it's almost a confession, but I'm putting it in a form of a question. What stops me, what gets in my way,
Yeah.
is that if I wanted to say something that was a contribution or that would lead the people who follow me in a
Mhm.
direction that I think is helpful and godly,
Mhm.
I'm stopped by the prominence of Black voices
Mhm.
that don't seem at all to want to deal with the profound problems in wide swaths of the Black community.
Mhm.
And then what happens is when and if I speak about this to my own people, I don't know what to answer when I am confronted with, well, did you hear what so-and-so said? And did you hear what so-and-so said? Most of the supposed self-appointed spokesmen for the Black community at this point are not willing to discuss anything other than systemic racism and not willing to discuss the problems that feed into racism. I'm not saying that racism is to blame by a Black victim. What I'm saying is there's certain stereotypes that Blacks seem to feed into, and I know I'm not. I know I'm treading on dangerous ground when I say that, but uh, um, I don't know what to answer. So I appreciate your clarity and your insight. Can you help me with that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for even asking that question. I'm grateful for this space because it's rare that we can find safe spaces to ask the real questions. And if we don't have that, then we don't get a chance to really move forward. I would say I could probably answer that with something that I've seen recently. When I first became a bit more vocal on social media about why racism has to stop and why we've got to adopt principles of being anti-racist and not just saying, you know, I like you, you're my friend, I've never been racist before. I had someone say back to me, well, until you people start caring about your own lives and stop your homicide rates, then how can you tell me to stop what I'm doing, so to speak? So comments like that tend, by and large, to ignore the ground level of what's really happening in the ground. And they also tend to ignore the highest levels of what this is about. So it is not to say that every time we say stop police brutality, we're also saying, but don't worry about Black crime in Chicago. But there is a sense of understanding that if we allow the nuances of those challenges to stop us from the unity that we have together, then we will not move forward. It is absolutely true that there are things that people within the Black community need to deal with, but it is also absolutely true that the reason why we have such poverty and such challenge in Chicago is due to racism, due to the massive atrocities that were happening prior to the civil rights movement. So I think, you know, in Christianity, you call this the original sin. You're like, well, what's the original sin? You know, and I think there has to be an acknowledgement that if you are here in America and technically globally, one of our original sins is racism. It is not the only sin. It is not the only issue. It's not the only thing we should focus on. But if we don't deal with that, we can't properly deal with the other things. We cannot deal with fatherlessness in Black communities until we deal with the improper incarceration rates of Black men. We cannot deal with education levels until we deal with the social inequities that keep the right kinds of foods out of poor neighborhoods, with the food deserts, with the lack of access to healthcare. I mean, we can't properly deal with young people who are having children out of wedlock until we deal with the structures of parenting and family that were torn apart in and post-slavery. So, I mean, obviously this is my perspective, but I really do think part of the challenge, and it's more of a challenge for you than it would be for me, because people assume, well, that of course you're going to say that. The challenge, I think, for people who are trying to look for ways to support, who are not Black, the challenge will be to keep the main thing the main thing. That is right. There are things that the community must deal with. but there are some things in the ground. There's racism in the ground. It's the Tulsa picture. It's the Charlotte picture. There are opportunities that have been removed from the Black community, and that's what we're trying to solve together. We cannot solve all things, but this here is what we're trying to do together. Does that care? I mean, I don't know if that even makes sense.
Yeah,
Yes.
it makes sense, and it appeals to the responsibility we have to ourselves, not to the Black community, but to ourselves.
Yes, exactly.
Which I think is a really an important point, and I think it's lost upon many. We're not doing this as a favor.
Right.
It's a spiritual defect in our own approach to God and to humanity, and we need to deal with that.
Yeah.
There's no question about that.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say there's no question. There is. I think
there are lots of questions. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm just really crying for, I would like to see some Black voices that are prominent in the height of this. I've told my congregation that I don't want to put a statement out about these issues in this atmosphere because no one's listening. Statements are actually they increase the noise, but nobody's interested in any kind of a dialogue through statements. I mean, this kind of thing is wonderful. I mean, we need hundreds of these kinds of things.
Yeah. And I had someone ask me last night, who are the Black voices? In the 60s, we had King. Who are the Black voices that are leading this movement? My response was, first of all, during the time of the 60s, there was no social media. There was no 24-hour news station. There was no, the church in the Black community was the space for social activism and engagement. It was the community center, it was all things. The makeup of culture was different. It was easy for one person to rise in that time. Now we've so democratized access that anyone can rise up and have voice. Now, the danger of that is the danger is the YouTube star. It's the person who, becomes famous because you make slime. It's like anyone can be somebody in today's age. But the opportunity I think we have is that we don't have to have one voice as long as we have a central message. And even if that central message is as simple as, we all have a responsibility to ensure that Black people in the United States have a chance. That can be the one voice that's repeated. And you can ask the question, is it better to have one theme repeated over 100 voices or one voice repeating it 100 times? That's the question. And I think in this age, the opportunity is to have that one voice and not to be derailed by the nuances thereof, but to really say, here's the responsibility we take. We want to ensure that when a Black man decides, I want to start a business, he doesn't have to worry about being blackballed because he can't get a loan. He doesn't have to worry about police officers coming and raiding or pushing him out. He doesn't have to worry about the drive from his house to his store. One small story, right after all of this started happening, actually it was more like 3 weeks ago, and the story is very personal for me. We have a 5 and a 7-year-old daughter, 5 and 7-year-old daughters. The news is constantly going. You're constantly seeing George Floyd. My daughter's caught a glimpse of George Floyd's daughter. She's 5, and caught a glimpse of her saying what she wanted to be when she grows up. Well, that particular day was a Thursday. It was raining really, really hard. And my husband, Mark, had to take the trash out. The girls started crying. We don't want Daddy to take the trash out. We don't want Daddy to get hurt. We don't want Daddy to die. And I could not, it was hard for me to process this innate fear that happens in the minds of young Black children that they carry through the generations. And that's what we're trying to deal with. That we want to create a space, a community where young Black children don't have to cry because Daddy's going outside. And this is the, for me, this is the heart. Yes, we have to deal with education. Yes, we have to deal with ensuring that families are strong in Black communities. Yes, we have to deal with Black communities taking ownership over what it means for them to steward their pulpits and space as well. And we've got to make sure that young Black children don't have this unnecessary fear.
Thank you. Rabbi Davies, who's a rabbi in Charleston, had to get off the phone, but he texted me, wanted me just to acknowledge that today is 5 years since the shooting in Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. We wanted to make sure that that was part of the record here today.
Yeah.
Rabbi Berman.
Yeah.
You have to unmute, please, Rabbi Berman.
So I have a couple of comments which sort of lead to a question, but deal with some of the issues that some others have raised as well, and build off something that you've just described. So when I think back on my own time and sort of my own sort of early period of engagement with social action issues, and particularly in relation to the Black community, I realize in retrospect all of that took place in the 1960s and the early 1970s, as Mrs. Lerner had spoken about earlier. And all of them were contextual.
Yes.
That is, they were all things that I did because of a need that arose at a particular moment in time in the setting in which I was. And so I was rabbi in Berkeley, California, and there was a serious problem of lack of integration, lack of integration of the public schools in Berkeley. And so I was, and one of the members of my shul, one of the vice presidents of my shul, was a member of the Board of Education of the city of Berkeley. And so I came to be involved in that effort to attempt to gain integration of the schools, of the racial integration of the schools in Berkeley. And then in 1965, when Martin Luther King issued a call to clergy after the first attempt at a march, or after the second in reality, but the call to come to Selma to engage in voting rights efforts. So I went to Selma, and I was arrested a couple of times, and that's sort of a separate whole long story. And then in the early 1970s, when I was Rabbi Young Israel of Brookline, they were changing neighborhoods in Boston at that time. There were lots of Jews who were caught in Dorchester Mattapan as the Jewish community moved out of there to Brookline, and I was involved in helping create integrated civilian patrol in direct cooperation with the police, that worked on sort of maintaining the safety of the entire community.
Yeah.
My sense is, and subsequent years, I had very little to do and really precious little engagement with the relationship to the issue of racism in the United States. And as I've been thinking about that more in these last few years, as I've come to think about these issues more, I realize that the racism problem is obviously too big for any one of us, or even any one of us as religious leaders, to deal with.
Yeah.
But the nature of the problem can be so locally identified.
Yes.
Whether it's a local problem related to access to health, whether it's problems of poverty, whether it's a problem related to education, whether it's the problem of safety, simple safety in the community, whether it's the issue of voting rights, whether it's the issue of a local prison and the way in which that's destructive of family life. It seems to me that the most effective, and I'd like your response, is the most effective way for each of us as rabbis to be engaged in this would be to identify just one piece, something that we in our community can be engaged in that has meaning to us within our community and the relationships amongst persons of faith within our communities. Then there's one other piece that I would like to mention, and that's sort of it emerges from experience I've had over these past few years. Our son, our oldest son, passed away just a few months ago, and he died of a disease that he had been suffering from for a very long period of time. But I don't speak about this publicly, really. But I deep in my heart, I believe that he died of 1,000 indignities that he experienced in his being hospitalized and his being in a nursing home. That over that span of almost 4 years, the indignities of the potential, in his particular case for a variety of reasons, the reality of the indignities that he experienced, the accumulation of small indignities of, I know we right now we're in a period in which all medical staff are glorified, and they deserve that glorification.
Right.
But you know, the moments when the nurse does not appreciate that an hour and a half late on pain medication means that that patient will be in sustained pain for the rest of that day because they're going to miss one administration of their pain medication during the day. You know, the aide who leaves someone on a bedpan, you know, without being concerned with the feelings of the patient in that situation. I mean, you can imagine, you've all seen hospitals, you've all seen, and they all mean well. I don't mean to, you know, and they are overworked. They are way overworked. But I have seen the power of accumulated indignities in ways that I had never appreciated before. And I must say, even in the early experience, our son did not appreciate in terms of what he was experiencing and what it was doing to his neshama, to his soul. And that has made me think recently about the indignities of a Black person who experiences people who turn away from him in the street. And you know, and when everybody else is said hello to and he's not said hello, he or she is not said hello to. The indignities of a parent grabbing the hand of a child much more tightly when a Black person walks by. The indignity of making a delivery to someone's home and they're not being addressed even as a person. You know, like there's a kind of dehumanization that we, particularly in this complex society, is easy to happen.
Yes.
And I've become convinced that, you know, the duration of the Black lifespan in the United States being 10 years less than whites of equivalent gender and is not just the consequence of medical care. It's I come to believe that it's also the consequence of the deterioration of the connection of the soul to their bodies.
Yes.
That happens in these little indignities, and that's something that we have the capacity to talk to. That we as rabbis and spiritual leaders need to help people understand that those indignities, that is a kind of denial of the Tzelem Elokim in people that happens in tiny little pieces. And you know, so I think that there are lots of things that we can identify that could help us make our own small contributions. I consider my contributions to this area very tiny and you know, sort of momentary. I think that if we all work on what it is in our own community and what it is in our own locale that can make a difference, that can ultimately make an enormous difference.
Wow. That is so well said, Rabbi Berman. I hope that you will write that one day. The idea of 1,000 indignities just really encapsulates something that I would call generational trauma. So it's not just the indignities of that one person's life, it is the indignities of their father's or mother's lives, plus the indignities of other lives. And it shows up in the way that we raise our children. Remember, you have to cross every T and dot every I because you have to work twice as good to be half as good, to be seen as half as good. It's the little things. When you go into that store, you don't pick up anything, you don't touch anything, because I don't want someone to assume that you're shoplifting. It's the little things. When you are wrong, you've got to get it right immediately. You've got to apologize profusely. And it comes from the generations. I mean, in America, it's 400 years of generations of stand up right, do the right thing, say the right thing. And then at a certain point, the other indignities come when even those actions don't guarantee that you won't be shot. Even not, even wearing the right clothes. My husband's actually right near me, and he has a story of being in a suit in New York and going to the train and carrying his briefcase. I mean, he's wearing a suit, he's got his briefcase, and he said a white woman walked toward him and moved her purse to the other side. Because God forbid a Black man in a suit with a briefcase might actually harm her. So you're absolutely right about the indignities. And they show up. They show up as symptoms of pain. And how we deal with this for Black Christians, the way we deal with this is deepening ourselves in faith. I mean, I love the fact that Jewish and Christian communities have a gift to offer the world. We know how to lament. We know the theology of lamentation. We understand what it means to cry out and say, how long, and to say, it's okay to say, I am hurt, I am grieving, I am broken, my heart is broken, and to lay all that before God. One of the biggest challenges for me personally in this time is that I haven't been able to go to my church. It used to be when Charleston happened, the shooting at Emmanuel, when Charlottesville was happening and that craziness, when Ferguson was going on and all the other cities, we would wait until Sunday so that we could get together, so that we could lift our voices together in song, recognizing that we're not by ourselves, so that we could link arms with someone in prayer, so that we could hear the word of God poured over us, like washing away the things of the world, reminding us of who we are in Christ. And without those things, it's been more challenging. So we've had to find those ways to manage the indignities by matching it with the dignity that we receive from God in faith. And I can tell you that is honestly how most people, Black people who are Christians, are making it through this day. It doesn't matter what they say about me. I know I'm made in his image. I'm the head and not the tail. I'm above and not beneath. It's like this kind of litany of scriptural affirmation that helps us. And maybe that's one of the small things that we can do together. Maybe one of the small things we can do together is to demonstrate to the world, you need faith to make it through this. You need to know that there is one who is higher and bigger and greater than all of this. And that there is a certain redemption that will happen, however that comes and through whatever lens, but it keeps us from believing that this is all there is. And when I think about, my dad as a preacher, used to be a preacher, he's retired. When I think about all of the things that he went through, and I asked him and my mom recently, how did you make it through? I mean, this is an honest truth. They say it was the grace of God. It's faith. It was knowing that this world is not all there is. And what they say about me is not my true definition, because I know who I am in Christ. Yeah.
So I was unfortunately, the time is up, and I was going to ask you as a last question, what gets you up in the morning? And you did it. You have educated us, you have sensitized us, you have inspired us. One of the things that Reverend Martin did not include in the introduction that she shared with everybody is that she's an award-winning preacher. Right? So when I told my wife that I was inviting her, she said, well, why? I said, well, all the things I said in the introduction, we actually, we were lurking on YouTube, and I found a sermon that Nicole gave that got me out of my seat.
Oh,
so if you're looking for inspiration, or if you're looking for a model of what it means to preach a little bit differently than most of us do in our synagogues, but what is possible in terms of inspiration, go to YouTube, look up Reverend Nicole Martin. I only listen to one at the moment, but I'm going back. Because your words are powerful. And if we were asked before, who are the Black voices, who are the leaders? So I think it's people like Nicole Martin that make a difference in her own way. So I thank you very, very much for being part of this and sharing with us. And I hope that, I know that the people here are going to move and act on your words. And I hope that we'll have the opportunity to engage with you many, many times in the future.
Oh, thank you so much, Rabbi Jack. Thank you for inviting me and for thinking of me for this time. Thank you all for the conversation. Really grateful.
It was beautiful. You did a good job.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. They were very powerful too.